Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. You guys are absolutely amazing and are so special to me, and I just value each and every one of you so much. And so let's get started with our story. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's start with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was rather ironic that on the inauspicious night that Ken Christie had experienced a fortuitous accident, he'd been watching a racing rally at the bar in town, on the television set there, where many of the townsfolk congregated together like a flock of congenial geese to watch the race. One of the rally drivers got himself entangled in a spot of trouble when his car became airborne and crashed fiercely onto its side, making a thunderous clanging commotion. It began to blow up into a ball of bright yellow flames, so it was swaddled in large tentacles of black smoke. Everyone in the bar held their breath in abject horror, wondering whether the rally driver would actually escape alive from the scrambled heap of metal that was now engulfed in flames. Luckily he'd been pulled out of the unforgiving furnace, having sustained severe third-degree burns. They could see him finally being ferried away by a medical team on a stretcher, looking incredibly bemused. There were a few firefighters attending to the unruly flames, frenziedly waving their hoses onto the fire. The excitable television presenter was speaking so furiously fast you could barely hear a word she was actually saying. She was so out of breath as if she'd run an exhausting marathon. "Folks, he's alive!" she shouted gleefully at the camera. "Thank God he's alive! But he sustained bad burning. We know that burns can kill." "Well, at least he's got a fighting chance," said one of the men in the bar, sounding optimistically hopeful. It was amazing how when you knocked back a few beers, the world would always have a sunnier, more positive outlook. Everything became infinitely more rosy. "He'll be fine," said a woman. "He's had a lucky escape." "Not so fast," said a man who sounded quite authoritative. "I work in the burns unit at the local hospital, and if the body is badly burnt, sometimes the patient does not recover, and many of those burns, I'm afraid, can bring on sepsis, which is very dangerous. I'm afraid the prognosis isn't necessarily good," he admitted. "The man could so easily die. He's not out of the woods yet." Ken lifted up his beer in a self-congratulatory gesture as he thought to himself smugly that he'd never ever had a car accident in his entire life. He had no understanding that such thoughts might actually be tempting fate, and even teasing it a little perhaps, like taunting a dog with a piece of jerky. Let's just say that Ken's unblemished record on the road did not mean he was an outstanding driver by any manner of means, although he misguidedly believed he actually was. Ostensibly it might mean he had been lucky, but as anyone can tell you, the wheel of fortune can so often change, and this night would not pan out to be Ken Christie's lucky night at all, although at this stage of the game he had no way of knowing this. For if he had any sense of prognostication of what was about to happen, he would never have got into the driving seat of his car. But ignorance can lead a lamb to the slaughter. For so long the naive man had believed himself invincible, but then again he was in his early 20s and believed he would live forever. And let's just say Mrs. Christie was tirelessly telling him that he was as callow and green as a young juvenile sapling. "I don't know what it is about young men at your age," she was always telling him. "You are in complete denial, Ken dear, as if you falsely assume you're going to live forever, and accidents only happen to those who join an exclusive club, which is why you drive so irresponsibly at times." Later, Ken would be forced to wonder if his mother's ominous words had come back to haunt him. Indeed, after the accident occurred, he had no comprehension that his cocky, self-indulgent sniggering and self-congratulatory hysterical laughter would eventually turn into dreadful sobs when the dawning of a revelation hit him as hard as a bucket of ice-cold water being flung over his head, when he realized that he'd actually killed a man. It must have occurred about 30 minutes away from the town of Wheeling, situated in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. A more apt description would be to say he was in the middle of nowhere, driving towards the cottage his friend Hugh Warrington had hired for his 25th birthday celebration. He was looking forward to seeing his closest friends again, and was sure this weekend would be an absolute blast. Ken could appreciate the glorious woodland setting and the prepossessing views of the mountains. He had no doubt that Hugh, who was always extravagant by nature, at the very best of times, and excelled himself by booking his friends into a place kitted out with the latest mod cons, as Hugh loved to wallow in the lap of luxury, and considering he had pockets that ran deep, he could easily afford to spoil his friends. All the cottage needed was a refrigerator overflowing with beers, and Ken would be as happy as a pig in muck. Ken had received several frustrated calls from a very indignant host, wondering where the hell he'd got to, as Hugh's guests were eager to start eating. "If you're not here in 20 minutes, Kenny," Hugh had complained, "we're starting without you. I told you to be here by 5:30. It's 8:30, for God's sake. What's keeping you for so long?" Ken mumbled some excuse under his breath. He was hardly going to admit to Hugh that he'd been drinking in a bar. Even when Ken had staggered out of the bar, looking ever so slightly sozzled, the kindly manager had asked him, "Sir, are you sure you're all right to drive? You have had rather a lot to drink. You're way over the legal limit. Would you like me to call you a taxi?" "Don't you worry about me," he had assured the concerned man. "I'm being picked up by a good friend of mine," he lied. Thank God he had had the foresight to clandestinely park his car away from the bar and the prying eyes of the townsfolk. By the looks of things, the very diligent bar manager had eyes in the back of his head that were as sharp as a hawk. Ken rarely believed he could manage his drink better than most, and was quite capable of driving after a couple of beers. But Ken's idea of a couple of beers was possibly substantially more. The inky black night that stretched out before him had turned a pitch-black colour when he left the twinkling lights of the town. Suffice to say, his car headlights offered the only visibility to see the road ahead, but nothing intimidated Ken. For most savvy drivers, the ambiguously dark shadows of a night devoid of any illumination would alert them to pay close attention to the road. But Ken was as relaxed and apathetic as an upside-down sloth swinging from the branches lackadaisically. He began swerving a little down the winding woodland road in his red SUV. There had not been a solitary soul around for many miles, and his only witnesses to his less than agreeable driving were the congregations of tall, lofty trees fringing either side of the road. But these remarkable verdant giants were silent witnesses who were not going to blab on him to the authorities, and in this part of the world, being pulled over by a cop who wished to take a breathalyzer was like looking for a needle in a haystack. It just was not going to happen. Suffice to say, Ken presumptuously believed he had the road to himself, having not encountered a car for many miles. His GPS was telling him where to go, so things were looking remarkably good for him at this point of the journey. Ken longed to have another beer. He was one of those people that could drink himself into oblivion, and had often found himself passed out on people's living room floors on numerous occasions. Of course, Ken knew he had overdone it on the beers tonight, but denial was a tool he employed even to deceive himself. Let's just say out here in the rural countryside, his secret was safe as a squirrel's stash of acorns is for the winter. All he needed to do was to find the cottage that Hugh had booked for their celebratory weekend, and the sooner he reached the cottage, the closer he would get to enjoying yet more beers and catching up with his old friends, whom he hadn't seen in an age, and Ken had missed his friends. Ken pushed his foot down on the accelerator in his hasty eagerness to be reunited with his friends again, and to get reacquainted with an ice-cold beer that was calling his name louder than any other voice he could hear in his head. He subsequently blew all caution to the wind, without a single care in the world, as he rocketed down the less than smooth road at an accelerated speed. He yawned as tiredness crept over him, and a growling stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten in a long while. How much longer was it going to be before he got to his destination? He had grown impatiently weary of the drive and was dreaming of food, beer, and a comfortable, cosy bed. He accelerated down the sharp curve in the road that he'd failed to see in time. His somewhat surprised rubber wheels were jolted out of their natural rhythm, losing traction on the road, skidding forward in a precarious zigzag motion. At one point his car seemed to be shooting towards the trees. He cried out in alarm as he tried desperately to press down his brakes, but being slightly inebriated, his reflexes were grossly impaired. His car jolted, juddered and heaved, and veered forwards, thankfully spinning away from the trees. Finally it stuttered, as if it was having an epileptic seizure, and ground to a satisfactory halt, and just stopped. Ken sighed with relief, letting out a hysterical laugh. He was invincible, he thought to himself. He was happy he'd overcome a potentially catastrophic accident. The bravado of the alcohol in his system meant he was still absurdly confident to continue on his journey, without any self-recrimination. And so with a cocky assertiveness he pressed his foot down on the gas again, and found himself reaching yet another dodgy-looking bend. Before he could react in time and coordinate the rhythm of his car, the vehicle, with a mind of its own, swung forcefully towards the right-hand side of the road. Ken had not seen the stranger walking down the road, but it was too late to manoeuvre his steering wheel away from the man, or to stop in time to avoid actually hitting him. Then he heard a mighty thud that told him immediately that something sizable had been hit very hard. The car wobbled uneasily, as if trying to stabilize itself, and skidded forwards, swerving the entire width of the road, and then it swiveled around to face the opposite direction. Once again, remarkably, his car came to a stop, narrowly missing the trees on the side of the road, by some miraculous good fortune of fate. Ken would have considered himself very lucky if he hadn't happened to see the unsettling forlorn shape lying in the middle of the road, which was caught up in the glare of his headlights. In a single second sobriety gripped him like a hard fist as he stared at the tenebrific lumpy shape, scrunching up his eyes to see it more clearly. He would like to say it was a bunch of tangled black bin liners lying there in the road, but he knew unequivocally he had hit something, or more to the point, someone. It was a dog or coyote, he told himself, but he knew it wasn't. Moments before impact he'd seen the figure of a man on the side of the road. He knew what he'd seen. Some things you cannot unsee. They are painted audaciously on your memory with an indelible ink that refuses to be erased. It would be easier to lie to himself, pretend it hadn't actually happened, turn the car around and proceed again on his journey, but he just couldn't do it. His conscience was already attacking every cell in his body, like a deadly disease. He had seen the moment before the collision, the shocked, bewildered expression on the man's face, the fear in his dark eyes, before his car had bulldozed through him without apology. He could pretend to himself he hadn't actually seen it. The figure in the middle of the road was not moving. Ken realized he might well be dead. "Oh my God!" he thought, tugging the hair on his head so tightly to anchor his arms in a self-soothing grip. "What the hell have I done? Oh, please, God, no! Don't let me have killed him!" The cruel reality of what had so fortuitously transpired hit him in the guts with a forceful ferocity, like a sledgehammer, so that every nerve ending in his body screamed out in terror. He felt like he wanted to throw up, as a dreadful feeling of nausea rose up in the back of his throat, and it was all he could do to keep the liquid contents of his stomach from making a reappearance. This couldn't be happening, not to him. Please, God, no! His heart began to pound frantically in his chest like a tennis ball beating hard against a wall. He knew what he had to do, and with trembling fingers he unlatched his safety belt and reluctantly tumbled out of the SUV, like a rolling drunk, easing himself back onto his feet, as he fell back awkwardly onto the road like a sack of very ungainly potatoes. It would seem the booze had really affected his coordination, as he staggered back, very uncomfortably onto his feet, like an old man with limited mobility. He cautiously moved a little closer towards a dishevelled, motionless figure, lying in the road like a bundle of disregarded rags. He was frightened about what he would invariably see, but he sighed with huge relief when he observed the body was twitching. This was a good sign. The man must still be alive. He could taste the sweet flavour of hope on his tongue. The man would be fine, he assured himself. I'll get him in my car, drive him to the nearest hospital. Ken suddenly remembered he'd been drinking, so there would be ramifications. He could get himself into serious trouble. If it was discovered he had run this man over while under the influence of alcohol, he knew instinctively he was over the limit, and if he was caught by the authorities he would easily serve a prison sentence. Well, I can drop him off anonymously at the hospital entrance, he reasoned with himself. A cool breeze brushed against his face, sharpening his senses, wiping away the sluggish feeling that had been rocking him off to sleep like a baby in a bassinet. The silence in the deserted road was deafening. Everything was hauntingly still, very airy. He suddenly felt as if all the trees of the woodgrove that surrounded him were whispering tauntingly among themselves. Look what he's done! Look what he's done! He felt as if every eye could see him, as translucently as a pane of glass, as if his guilt was written all over his face, like the headlines on a newspaper. The man was lying in the road like a dead bird, hanging on to his last desperate moments. Even his legs seemed to be folding and curling up like a dying bird's would. He could see the chest moving up and down, and observe the legs and arms lying at odd, unnatural angles, while the face was distorted so badly there was no telling the age of the man, or even what he actually looked like. If that wasn't bad enough, blood was seeping out of the body. It looked suspiciously like it was coming from the head. That was not good. It was an unpalatable sign indeed. Ken considered it likely that the man was about to peg out in any second. It was all too late to save him. What would be the point in taking responsibility for this accident? It would invariably mean not only one life would be ruined, but two, and that would be a dreadful nonsensical waste. It would be madness. If the man was beyond help, then he may as well continue on his way with his journey and get the hell out of here, as there was not much more he could do for the man. To Ken's horror, the stranger's eyes popped open wide. Then there was a gurgling sound that came from the back of his throat. He cried out, "Please, please, help me, help me." That was what Ken thought he was saying. Ken's high-pitched voice betrayed his angst. "You're going to be fine," Ken said, leaning over the man on bended knees. "I'll get you to the hospital, I promise." The man choked on his blood. There was a gurgling sound from the back of his throat. He slumped back onto the road. Ken was freaking out. He grabbed his hair again. "Shit, shit, shit," he said. "This can't be happening. It just can't." For a moment he was tempted to get into his SUV and hightail it out of there as fast as he could. But the man had pleaded him for help, and he had promised him he would take him to the hospital. His conscience prickled him, although in truth he held out little hope for the man's deteriorating condition. "I could phone emergency services," he surmised, "give them my location, and then just hang up." But Ken didn't know exactly where he was, and maybe people might recognize his voice. They could do a lot of recriminating things these days, as phone calls could be taped and even traced. He'd watched enough crime documentaries to know that voice recognition was one of the tools the police used in an investigation. It wasn't worth the risk. The best idea was to drop the man outside the entrance of the hospital and get the hell out of there. That way no accusatory fingers could be pointed in his direction. Ken trembled when he heard the man groaning in the road. "Think," he told himself. "Bloody think." "You can do this, Ken," he assured himself. He climbed into the car and reversed until the back door was facing the man in the road, and then he dragged the body like a sack of potatoes, as it was far too heavy to lift, and managed to somehow pull the man onto the back seat. How he did this he didn't know, but failure in this taxing endeavour was not an option. Ken got into the driver's seat and with his cell phone Googled the nearest hospital, his mind surprisingly sharp for one so inebriated. The shock of this experience had jolted him out of his ambiguous, foggy curtain of intoxication. The man's duffel bag was lying in the middle of the road, near an ominous pool of his own blood. Ken grimaced when he observed the crimson puddle that reminded him of how gravely serious this accident actually was. He could only hope that the man would survive the trip to the hospital. What if he died on the journey? The thought was too dreadful to contemplate. There was a solemn, macabre, airy silence in the car as Ken drove away, with his disfigured patient lying on the back seat. He occasionally heard the man grunting, and the sound reassured him that he was doing the right thing to get the stranger help. An unsettling feeling clung to Ken, like an oyster on a rock. Perhaps he had known it all along. He knew in his gut that this man was not going to make it. His efforts to take him to the hospital were futile. When there was no movement from the body in the back of his car, Ken just knew that the stranger was dead. He grimaced, wincing like a dog crying out in pain. But the noises Ken was making were the emotional turmoil of regret and remorse. He drew his truck to a stop, climbing out of his car, and opening the back door to check on the man. The man's still warm body was motionless, and there were incriminating pools of blood on his back seat. Ken knew it was too late. The man was beyond help. He had no pulse. His eyes were glazed over like a dead fish, and blood was drooling down his mouth onto Ken's leather seats. Ken recoiled. He knew that the man was dead. Dee's account. There were 6 of us at Hugh's birthday bash. We were all close childhood friends. The only one that was very late was Ken Christie. Why did that not surprise me? Ken Christie was always the one that held everyone up when we were kids. I mean, why change the perennial habits of an entire lifetime? Ken seemed to never arrive anywhere on time. And let's just say Hugh's birthday bash was no exception to this golden rule. The food from the barbecue had been prepared. Piping hot plates of delicious-smelling chicken kebabs, burgers and lamb chops were on full display, next to bowls of Greek salad and bread rolls. I was famished, so were my friends. "Look, Hugh, we're half-starved. You know what Ken is like. He's notorious for being late. I think we should eat without him." "I've already phoned him," said Hugh, his feathers looking as ruffled as those of a pigeon that has had an unfortunate run-in with the household tabby. Hugh hated it when things didn't go according to plan. "He told me he would be here 20 minutes ago. So where the hell is he?" I raised a scathing eyebrow. "Look, Hugh, I know you want to play the impeccable host, but forget it. We're all friends, for goodness sake. Let's just go with the flow this evening and not wait on Ken. If the barbecue is cold for him, well, so be it. It's still very tasty. He won't be losing out. Cold barbecue could be delicious." Hugh looked heartily relieved by my suggestion. "You're absolutely right, Dee. You were always the one who was practical and sagaciously wise with it. Let's eat," he agreed, and that is exactly what we did. The mood was celebratory, the food excellent, but we all felt the loss of Ken's presence at the table. Growing up, it had always been the 7 of us, so one person missing felt as if things were certainly off-kilter. Ken made a rather sorry appearance. Half an hour later, when he arrived, I noticed a strong smell of alcohol in his breath, but he seemed as withered and deflated as a bedraggled flower, hanging limply in a vase, or like someone who's climbed to the very top of Mount Everest and is ready to drop from sheer exhaustion. I do not remember a time when I'd ever seen our beloved friend look so worse for wear. It wasn't difficult to discern that something was up with him. Ken's idiosyncratic behaviour told me as much, and my instincts were in overdrive. Something was wrong with him. I was even more troubled by the grisly sight of the spots of blood on his shirt and fingers, and wondered if he'd actually hurt himself. "Ken, what on earth is the matter with you?" I asked. Ken recoiled at my words, as if they'd hit him as hard as a baseball bat across the shins. His face paled, so that he became as white as a sheet of paper, and then he whispered under his breath, "I've just killed a man." "What?" I cried aghast. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ken slumped on the sofa, covering his face with his blood-soaked hands and transferring some of the blood onto his face. For a long while he sobbed, and we could do nothing but stand there staring at him in abject astonishment. "What did you say?" I asked Ken again, sure that I must have misheard his ominous confession. Ken choked through his tears, as his words spattered out of his mouth, like reluctant oil droplets being heated on a gas hob. "On the road. I ran a man over." We didn't get much more out of Ken. who was caught up in the bubble of his remorse and regret. It seemed like his mind was trying hard not to focus on the gravity of what he'd done. Perhaps it was his delayed shock response, when you tried to zone out of your reality. "Where did this happen?" we asked. "Where is the man's body? Is he all right? Where is he?" "In the back of my truck," said Ken, sobbing. "He's dead." We all stared at each other in horror. My first thought was we must call the police at once, but Hugh was not keen on this idea, not given the mortifying consequences of what Ken had told us he'd actually done. "Dee," he insisted, "look at Ken. He's as drunk as a skunk. He's run over a man tonight in the middle of the road, accidentally killing him. My mother had a friend who was caught drink driving. She went to prison for 15 years, and she didn't even kill anyone. What will happen to Ken? He's our friend. Friends don't go dobbing each other to the police. We have been fiercely loyal to each other since we were kids. We should remember that. That's what friends do. They look out for each other. They have each other's backs. It's called integrity. Do you really want Ken to be locked up in prison for years and years? Because Ken will end up living among evil men who might beat him up, even kill him, and abuse him for sure. Do you want that for our friend? Ken would never cope with life in prison. You know it, I know it. Underneath all the bravado, he's actually a sensitive soul. Of course I don't want Ken to go to prison. But we have to do the right thing, I said. Ken should never have got into his car drunk. He knows that. Everyone knows that behaviour like that is criminal. No one should ever drink and drive. It's reckless. It's against the law. I'm sorry, Dee. But Hugh's right, said Jackson, interceding. You always want to do everything by the law, Dee. But sometimes you have to put family first. Ken is like a brother to us. Always has been. We cannot betray him by dobbing him to the police. We must protect him. It's called being loyal, Dee. Look at some of these people in authority, prime ministers and stuff like that. It's an absolute joke. They've got enough dirt on them, some of them, to lock them up in prison for yonks. But they always get away with their duplicitous crimes, without even so much as a scratch or any kind of recrimination. So many of them have incredibly bad reputations that are less than savoury. But are they accountable? Absolutely not. I believe even the media covers up what they've done. And our good friend here made one little mistake, and he has to pay for it for years and years. I think not, said Jackson, shaking his head fiercely. Then the way I see it, Jackson, is that you're complicit in this crime. The dead man's got a family, I said. Loved ones, who'll be wondering where on earth he is. At the very least they should be able to bury their loved one. And as for Ken, we can always get him the very best lawyer. Maybe he'll get off with involuntary manslaughter. I'm with Dee on this, said Sheila. I think we need to call the police. It's the right thing to do. I think we should first establish who this man actually is, said one of our friends, Tyson, who was always very practical and pragmatically level-headed. We all stoically trooped to the back of Ken's truck to witness the dead man for ourselves and establish his mysterious identity. Thankfully, the red SUV didn't look as if it had been involved in a hit and run at all, apart from a little blood spatter on the front of the car that could easily be wiped away if need be. I grimaced when I saw the crumpled deceased body lying on the back seat. It was the most gruesome sight I'd ever seen. The man's face was no longer recognizable. I realized that Ken had indeed brought a problem to our front door, and we were going to have to fix up his mess, like we invariably always did. Some birthday bash this was turning out to be. All I could feel was pity for this poor deceased man and his family. But what had he been doing in the middle of the night, walking down a strange country road, in the middle of nowhere? It didn't make any sense at all. I was clandestinely determined that in no way was I not going to call the police. I would do it. My father was involved in criminal law. I'm sure he could get Ken a great lawyer. Hugh pulled out the duffel bag next to the man. We guessed it must belong to him. We were certain we would find out the man's identity from rummaging through his things. Hugh emptied the contents of the duffel bag on the floor, and we all gasped in horror. What we saw changed absolutely everything, and now we did not feel remotely sorry for the deceased man lying in the back of Ken's car. In the bag was bundles of money, tied up together in neat elastic bands, and at a guess it looked like over $80,000 in cash notes. There was a very sharp knife covered in blood, and a Freddy Krueger mask. We all just stared at each other in abject horror, and Jackson looked triumphant. "Now do you really want Ken to go to prison for killing this man? It looks like he did the world a favour. This man appears to be a cockroach. It suspiciously looks like he's already slit someone's throat, or at the very least stabbed a man. If this knife is anything to go by, look at the dried blood it's covered with." I looked at my friends in horror. I knew what they were saying was true. It was likely that the dead man in the back of the car had caused someone grievous bodily harm, or even death. Did men like this deserve even to live among us? If he had harmed someone, then he was evil, and there was no way that Ken should be locked up in prison for years and years for a man like this. Even so, I felt wretched for the man's poor family. Someone out there must care for him surely, despite what he had done. Me and my friends stared at each other blankly, not knowing what we should do. There was no identification to be found in the duffel bag. "Well, he may be carrying something on his person," Hugh suggested. "In a back pocket, perhaps." We all squirmed with revulsion at the idea of fumbling around a dead corpse to look for any identification, but we didn't have much choice in the matter. We needed to find out who this nameless man actually was. I was certain he must have a criminal record. All 6 of us gathered around the truck, as Hugh and Jackson wrestled to feel around in the dead man's pockets to see if they could find any ID. Ken was on the sofa completely passed out from exhaustion, oblivious to all that was going on behind his back. I felt as if I'd been bulldozed into a movie, into the heart of an Agatha Christie novel, as everything that transpired felt so surreal. Jackson rolled the dead body over onto its back. The body was heavy. It was a dead weight. It was Hugh who pulled out a wallet from the man's pocket. He opened up the wallet, and we discovered the man's identification. His photograph certainly did not do him any favours. Put it this way, if I saw that man walking down the street, I would have almost certainly crossed over to the other side to escape him. He looked like a thug, someone whom if you provoked the wrong way would ultimately wreak his revenge by hiding out in the dark shadows to pounce on you unaware and leave you dying in a gutter from a nasty slit to the throat. Even the dead eyes staring back at us in the photograph looked like the man didn't even own a soul. Sheila studied the photograph curiously. The man we discovered was called Rebel. "He's a villain," she said. "Look at his eyes. They have no compassion in them. If you ask me, it was not Ken who ran him down tonight on the road. It was karma that finally caught up with him. He was living on borrowed time, I promise you that. Ken was being used as an instrument of that karma that was out to actually get him." I could not help feeling that Sheila was absolutely right. My self-righteous views about going to the police were dissipating as fast as steam from a kettle, especially after what we were to learn later, when Hugh had done some research online and was able to reveal to us who the mystery dead man was, lying in the back of Ken's car. His name was Rebel Walter Riley. Let's just say he wasn't the salt of the earth. He is definitely one of life's cockroaches, let's just say. He's been in prison on numerous occasions for assault with a deadly weapon. He is at large at the moment, wanted by the police, suspected in a series of robberies involving elderly women, where he's absconded with their life savings and stabbed them. Some of them have died, I believe. So he's a person of great interest in regards to several murders. His fingerprints were found on the scenes of these murders. He's an evil bastard. That's what he is. My guess is he's been living out here in the middle of nowhere to hide away from the police. I suspect when Ken ran him over, he was trying to find another spot to lie down low. Perhaps he uses the hours of darkness as his secret way of moving to another location, which may explain why he's carrying all that money with him." None of us felt remotely sorry for rebel Walter Riley, lying deceased in the back of Ken's car, who in some states would be given the death penalty for what he'd done. I was a firm believer in the death penalty. The way I saw it was if you had a Turkish rug that was being eaten alive by moths, or experienced a ghastly outbreak of roaches in your kitchen, an infestation, so to speak. They needed to be exterminated to prevent further damage. How much of our hard-earned taxpayer dollars went to paying for the upkeep of evil men in our society, whose only contribution to humanity had been a miserable, insufferable one, where they had contributed exponentially to the evil in the world, which we could do well without. There was enough of that already going around, was there not? Ironing it out for a better world where our children could actually walk down the street safely made perfect sense to me. Furthermore, some of our loved ones have perished at the hands of men like rebel Walter Riley. Granted, there were of course innocent men, falsely accused of crimes they did not commit, and that was my only hesitancy in regards to the death penalty. So that is the end of part 1. Part 2 is where we'll get our Bigfoot encounter, so don't forget to tune in tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.